Hello everybody, I'm Chris, and I'd like to welcome you back to the series that I'm doing on analyzing literature and how to analyze stories, novels, plays, etc. So in the previous two installments of this series, we did a deep dive into character and conflict. And in the previous episode, we looked very in-depth at different ways that authors create memorable characters. So we did all kinds of ways that an author can use to create lasting, three-dimensional, well-rounded characters. So I welcome you to go and look at those first two installments. And today we're not going to spend much time talking about characters and conflict. In this segment, we're going to look at how character and conflict drives the plot. So what I want to focus on more today is plot. So just a quick reminder, when we talk about character, we're talking about the who of the story. Who is involved in the story? Who are the people that we are looking at, reading about in the story? So the first and most important thing we have to do about character is locate the protagonist. Who is the main character? So all of the action of the story revolves around the protagonist. So it is our job as readers to figure out and discover who is the central character, who is the protagonist. And then the conflict, which is defined as the central problem or struggle facing the protagonist, is represented in various ways. So we took a lot of time to look at the different types of conflict. And I gave examples of short stories and works that contain each of these different types of conflicts. And the reason why I did that was that I wanted people to see that these terms and these concepts that we're talking about and we're explaining, these are not just nebulous concepts. These are not just abstract ideas. These are things which are actually concrete and identifiable and discoverable in works of literature. So these are the real building blocks and the real foundations of what we can find in works of literature. So it's not just something out there which has no basis in reality. It's something that authors make use of, and we can analyze out of stories if we have the knowledge, if we have the experience, and if we have the practice of how to do that. So that is the main purpose of my attempt to sort of link these different types of conflicts and these different types of characters discussed in the previous episodes to specific works and specific stories and specific novels and things of the like, to show that they do have some foundation. Like I said, they are grounded in reality. So in any case, the central problem or struggle that the main character faces, that is also part of what drives the plot, because as we said in the previous installments, the main character has something to achieve, wants something, wants to have something, wants to get something, wants to achieve something. So that is what the character is driven to do, to accomplish that goal, to accomplish that mission. And that, of course, is what the plot is all about. So if the character is the who, and the conflict is the central problem or struggle that character faces, plot is defined as what actually happens in the story. So, a short definition of plot would be a connected chain or sequence of events in a story. That is what we have seen in the past as a very common definition of the word plot. So, today we're just going to look briefly at what is known as the traditional plot structure. And again, this type of information is widely taught around schools in America, and it is in fact what I was taught when I was in school, middle school and high school, more than 30 years ago. So it is still being taught widely around the country even today in middle schools, junior high schools, and even into colleges and universities. I've seen these things taught. So I like to use the word traditional plot structure because this refers to the way that literature was organized for the main part in what we call the classic short story writers, the classic novelists of the day. So nowadays, you will see a lot of modern writers, they experiment with more or less different types of plot structures, different types of organizational methods on how to tell a story. So if you're looking at a modern writer today, you might not find it follows this exact pattern or this exact formula. But if you're looking at things which are widely studied in schools and things that you are going to be asked to write about in the form of an essay or some kind of examination, like the SAT or the MCAS exam, you'll probably be able to find a story or a novel that you could use, or even a play that you could use, which would contain probably all of these elements in the order in which they are arranged here. So let's go through the order quickly here. So this is what is called the traditional plot structure, as we just said. It contains 5 elements, and I'd like to touch upon each element here briefly. So the first part of the story over here on the left is called the exposition, and is sometimes you will hear it referred to as the introduction or the background. So when an author starts a story, that author will introduce the setting and the characters. This is the standard way or the traditional way of introducing a story. You introduce the setting, the time, the place of the story, the era, historical time period of the story, whether it's in the past, the present, or even into the future. There are futuristic writings, of course, science fiction and the like. So at the beginning of the story, it is traditionally done. The setting and the characters are introduced. And by characters, I'm not saying that all of the characters are introduced at the beginning. Obviously, we're talking about the introduction of the main character. And probably a couple of minor characters, perhaps. But generally speaking, we're looking at the introduction of the main character, the protagonist of the story. So the central who of the story is what we want to focus on. And then we're going to move into what is called rising action. So rising action is, again, we're going up on the diagram this way, up to this point right here. So, as part of the rising action, it is tradition that this is where the conflict is introduced. So when the conflict is introduced, I've seen other textbooks and other teaching materials which call them complications, because we're talking about a central problem or struggle. So this struggle can have more than one aspect. This struggle can have more than one facet. So as people move through this struggle, they may have to overcome various obstacles, not just one obstacle. So that, I think, is one of the reasons why they call it complications as part of the rising action. Complication 1, complication 2, complication 3, as you go up the side of that diagram. Because, again, the protagonist has to go through maybe more than one obstacle, has to overcome more than one hurdle on his or her way to achieving his or her mission. So that's all part of the rising action. So you may see it diagrammed that way, with complication after complication after complication, until you reach part 3 or point 3, which is known as the climax. So in the previous 2 installments of this series, I talked about the climax being defined as the high point or turning point of the action. So this is actually the point in the story where the conflict is resolved. So let's say, for example, we're looking at a conflict of character versus character. Well, here at the climax would be the high point or the turning point, where that antagonist, or if you want to use the word villain, is defeated. Okay, so this is where the conflict is decided. But that's typically not the end of the story. Now, it can be deceiving if you look at a diagram like this and you see the high point of the action is up here, and you draw a line down the middle, like so. You might think, oh, the climax always comes in the middle of the story. Well, again, it's a little bit deceiving to say that, because the climax does not always automatically have to become or is found in the middle of the story. All right? It can come further down on the scale even in this course of a narration of a story. So not all the time are you going to find it, precisely in the middle of a story, if you want to think about it that way. And again, modern writers will experiment with different ways of organizing the action of a story and play around with these different types of sections in such a way that it is not going to follow this traditional pattern. But for the most part, it's diagrammed this way because it is the highest point of the action. And then after the climax, we get what is called the aftermath. So over here I put falling action, and I put the notation aftermath, because we have to look at what happens as a result of the victory of that struggle, right? So as we see, a struggle as part of the conflict has to be overcome. So the protagonist has to succeed in some way. But what happens after that? What is the aftermath of that struggle? What is the aftermath of that conflict? And we look at how the character is changed or transformed. We talked in great detail about that in the previous installment of this series. How the conflict changes the character, how the character is transformed through the experience of working through that conflict. That's all part of the falling action and aftermath leading up to the final resolution, or again, what is called the denouement. So the denouement resolution is at the end of this diagram because, as you see, it sort of balances out the left side and the right side. So if we go horizontally across this diagram, we're sort of at the same level, starting level, as we were at the beginning of the story. So this is done deliberately to show that when you reach the end of a story, there is a kind of balance that is restored and a kind of, as it says here, return to a state of stability or balance. So the right-hand side and the left-hand side are pretty much on an equal plane. And the reason for that is that through the resolution of the conflict, we're back to normal, right? We're back to a state of normalcy, as the expression goes. However, we have to understand, as we discussed in the previous episodes, the character is not the same at the end as he or she was at the beginning. And we talked about dynamic characters versus static characters. And most of the time, the characters who are the protagonists do transform, do change in some way. They are affected sometimes very deeply by their experiences with the conflict. So they're not the same person they were at the beginning. They learned something, they grew somehow, they changed somehow. And that is what we have to consider as part of the resolution. Now, there are a couple of other items I want to discuss in relation to plot and plot structure. And these are the terms over here, situational irony and dramatic irony. So these two terms, situational irony or irony of situation, is also related to how an author will establish different ways of organizing the plot, organizing the details of the plot, what happens in the story. So situational irony and dramatic irony are techniques that authors use, and we can analyze these out of certain types of stories when we discover them. So, for example, let me just discuss briefly what irony means in general. So irony in general means a contrast or an incongruity between what is expected to happen and what actually happens in a story, or what the characters think is going to happen, or all of the aspects or all of the details of the story lead the characters to believe something is going to happen in a certain way, but then out of the blue, something changes, something happens which is totally opposed to their thought what was going to happen, and then they get caught by surprise, of course. So, irony of situation is like that. You know, you might call it a plot twist. Or if you think about a story such as the original Jaws, as I mentioned in the previous installments, we have this group of people, the oceanographer, the police chief, and the shark hunter on this boat trying to track down and kill this great white shark. Who is it that we would think would be most likely to succeed as a victorious, person in this struggle against this great white shark? You would probably think that, okay, this shark hunter who has like 20 years experience or more hunting all kinds of sharks and has killed all the sharks that he's ever hunted would be the most likely to survive. But as it turns out, that's not the case. So at the end of that story, we know that it's the police chief who is actually the one who kills the shark. And the thing about the police chief is that he's someone who hates water. He never goes in the water, he never goes swimming, he doesn't like water at all. And he's the one, ironically, who ends up killing the shark. And that's a case of situational irony, because the shark hunter is the one who gets killed and eaten, and the police chief, who's actually afraid of water, is the one who ends up killing this massive creature, this killing machine, this great white shark. So that would be an example of situational irony. That's something that we wouldn't expect and the characters would not expect. Now, dramatic irony also is a way that authors can use to shake us up. So, in dramatic irony, by definition, it means we as readers know something is going to happen. We are told what's going to happen, or we're given clues, or we're given hints of what's going to happen. But the characters themselves don't know what's going to happen. Or they have some lack of foresight, or some lack of ability to think about logically what's going to happen. And then we, as the audience, see their progression through these stages where they come to this comprehension of what's going to happen, oftentimes too late. And just to give an example of dramatic irony, if you think of a story that is commonly taught in high schools and even middle schools perhaps, is called The Monkey's Paw, which is this kind of supernatural story of how this person visits a family in England, and he's got this magical monkey's paw that has been given sort of the power to grant wishes, right? So everybody who owns the paw has the ability to make 3 wishes. But everybody who's owned the paw previous to this guy giving it to this head of this family, Mr. White, has had some evil circumstance befall them as a result of their encounter or their experience with this monkey's paw. And even the guy who gives the paw to Mr. White, Sergeant Morris, he tells Mr. White, get rid of it, throw it in the fire. I'm not responsible for what's going to happen. So as readers, we can see these things as warnings of bad things to come. But Mr. White, he's not able to see these things. He's more caught up in his greed, his lust for wealth and power. But he doesn't really believe 100% in the monkey's paw, but he does a little test, a little experiment, wishes for some money, not a huge amount of money, just to sort of give a test to see if it will work. But then what happens? The result of that, I'm not going to give away the ending, but the result of that is something bad happens. So we as readers, we know from all this information beforehand that bad things are going to happen to these people if they, are foolish enough to proceed with these wishes. So that would be an example of dramatic irony. So situational irony, dramatic irony, there are other types of irony, but we won't get into that right now because I think these two are closely related to how an author develops a plot. So right now, we're going to take a little break. I'm going to clear the board, and then I'm going to go into how to organize a sort of rudimentary analysis of a short story by Edgar Allan Poe known as The Cask of Amontillado. So let's do that. Let's take a break, and then in the next part of this video, we'll get into the specifics of how these things could appear in a work of literature such as the short story.